Camilla's shriek sliced through the tranquil morning air. It was a declaration, not just an accusation. Seconds later, I felt the cold ratchet of handcuffs cinching around my wrists. Through the gap between the office and the parked car, I could see her, phone held high. Camilla Williams was live-streaming my arrest to the entire neighborhood. Just 3 days ago, I had finalized the purchase of the Lake Reserve. I wasn't a developer. I was a conservationist. I'd bought the 40-acre property to protect it, to save a piece of the environment from suburban sprawl. Now, I was being paraded like a common thief. A crowd of 50 neighbors had gathered, their faces a mixture of anger and genuine terror. They weren't just curious. They were afraid. They believed they were about to lose their water supply. What nobody understood yet, including me, was that the documents I'd signed were about to detonate a crisis that would redefine this entire community. If you've ever tried to do something good, only to find yourself painted as a villain, you know the feeling. Comment and tell me where you're watching from. This story is only getting started. The morning hadn't begun this way. My plan had been simple: load up my surveying equipment and head to the reserve. I wanted to set up some preliminary boundary markers to finally walk the land I had spent 8 long months meticulously researching and acquiring. Instead, I was standing on the dirt access road, cuffed. Camilla Williams, the iron-fisted president of the local Homeowners Association for 2 decades, was addressing the officer while keeping her phone camera locked on me. "Officer, you need to grasp the situation," Camilla continued, her voice amplified for her audience. 300 families depend on this lake for their water. This man just purchased our entire water source. He's planning to cut us off. I tried to interject, to explain, but Officer Miller raised a hand to silence me. He looked genuinely baffled. Let me get this straight. Mr. Mitchell here claims he bought a nature preserve. You're claiming he bought your water supply. Those sound like 2 very different things. Camilla's voice jumped an octave. They are the same thing. The Lake Reserve has been our community's water source since 1952. We have grandfather rights, historical easements. This man is a predator, trying to steal what is rightfully ours. I looked past her at the crowd. These were people I had hoped to meet at a bake sale or a town hall, not during my own arrest. Their fear was palpable. This wasn't drama for social media. They truly believed their taps were about to run dry. Despite the cuffs, I kept my voice level. I gestured with my head toward my truck. My sealed impact reports are in there. Maps covered in habitat notations. Locked tool cases meant to protect the shoreline, not drain it. "Then why?" Camilla challenged, stepping closer, her camera zooming in until my face filled her screen. "Does your property deed include language about all riparian and watershed rights? Why does it bear a federal stamp instead of just a county recording?" That stopped me cold. I had, of course, noticed the federal stamp during the closing. My attorney had dismissed it as a bureaucratic formality for properties over a certain acreage. The riparian rights clause seemed like standard legal boilerplate for any land that included a water feature. Officer Miller looked between us, his patience thinning. "Mr. Mitchell, do you have your purchase documentation with you?" "It's in my briefcase in the truck." I nodded, along with the environmental impact studies, federal permits, and state fish and wildlife coordination papers. "Federal permits." Camilla's voice cracked just slightly, a note of performative surprise. "For a simple nature preserve. Any property that includes protected wetlands and serves as a habitat for migratory birds requires federal oversight," I explained, though a seed of doubt was beginning to sprout in my own mind. "It's standard procedure." Even as I said it, I was flashing back to the closing. The seller's attorney had been unusually insistent about specific clauses. There was language about watershed boundaries that I had assumed was just hyper-precise legal description. Officer Miller retrieved my briefcase and pulled out the thick deed. As he scanned the text, his brow furrowed. "Mr. Mitchell, this document states your property includes all water sources, tributaries, and watershed catchment area in perpetuity." That's extremely specific language. "The whole point is to protect the entire ecosystem," I replied, but my voice wavered. The doubt was growing. Camilla stepped forward again, sensing her advantage. "Officer, I've been fighting to protect this community's water for 20 years. I've seen developers try this. They buy the land, then hold us hostage for access to our own water. But this is worse. This man has a federal deed. That means he can override any local easements or grandfather rights we thought we had. The crowd behind her began to murmur angrily. Cut off our water. What about our kids? Officer Miller said, looking stressed, I'm not seeing a crime here. This is a property dispute. It's a civil matter. Then explain this. Camila produced her own folder. I did some research the moment we heard about the sale. The last private owner of that property tried to charge the community for water access back in 1995. The community fought him, and he eventually sold. Now this man shows up with federal paperwork that supersedes everything. I stared at her. How did you find information on previous ownership disputes? Public records, Mr. Mitchell, she sneered. Something you should have looked into before you bought property that hundreds of families depend on for their very survival. Officer Miller, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, handed my deed back. I'm uncuffing you, Mr. Mitchell, but I strongly advise you to get legal counsel and figure out exactly what you purchased. And he turned to Camila. I suggest you do the same. As the handcuffs came off, I rubbed my wrists and faced the crowd. The anger was still there, but it was suffocated by fear. They weren't villains. They were families. I raised my voice, promising to keep the taps flowing while we saw to the paperwork, and asked for a small committee to walk the site with me. Intentions don't matter, Camila replied, though her voice was calmer. Legal rights do, and according to this federal deed, you now own our water. That's when I noticed him, a man in an expensive suit, standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the entire scene with a detached, professional interest. He'd been on his phone earlier, and I dismissed him as just another neighbor. As the crowd began to thin, he approached me. Mr. Mitchell, I'm Thomas Marcus Morgan. He handed me a business card. I'm an attorney specializing in water rights law. Mrs. Williams' office called me this morning after she discovered your purchase. I looked at the card. The firm was local, but his credentials screamed federal expertise. You came here because Camila called you. Morgan nodded, his expression smooth and reassuring. Cases involving federal water rights are my specialty. The good news is most of these disputes can be resolved amicably once everyone understands the legal framework. Camila, still filming, addressed him. Mr. Morgan, are you suggesting his federal deed giving control over our water? I'm suggesting that water rights law is extremely complex, Morgan said, especially when federal and local jurisdictions overlap. What I see is a reasonable person who wants to protect the environment, he gestured to me, and a community that needs access to clean water. He smiled. There's usually a solution that serves everyone. A wave of profound relief washed over me. Finally, someone who understood. Would you be willing to represent me in sorting this out? Pro bono, Morgan said immediately. Cases like this interest me professionally. It sounds like you're trying to do the right thing. Camila finally lowered her phone. Mr. Morgan, this community will not be intimidated or bought off. Understood, Morgan replied. And I hope you understand that Mr. Mitchell purchased this property through entirely legal means. The goal here is solution. As I watched Camila nod, I felt cautiously optimistic. But as I glanced down at my deed, at that federal stamp and the words, in perpetuity, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stumbled into a legal minefield. Mr. Morgan, I said, as Officer Miller drove away, exactly how complex are we talking? Morgan's expression turned serious. Mr. Mitchell, federal water rights law hasn't been significantly updated since the 1890s. When property like this changes hands, it can raise questions that haven't been tested in court for decades. I have a feeling this case is going to be more interesting than any of us realize. 3 days earlier, I was in a sterile closing attorney's office, signing what I believed was a culmination of 8 months of careful due diligence. As a land surveyor and development consultant, I'd handled complex acquisitions before, but the Lake Reserve was different. This wasn't for profit, it was for preservation. The 40-acre property was ecologically pristine, wetlands, old-growth forests, and a clear lake that served as a vital stopover for migratory waterfowl. My research had been methodical, environmental impact assessments, soil composition studies, hydrological surveys. I'd coordinated with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the EPA. The six-figure price tag was substantial, but my consulting business was successful. I saw it as a legacy, a sanctuary my children would inherit instead of another strip mall. Now, sitting in Thomas Marcus Morgan's plush law office the morning after my arrest, I was reviewing those same documents with a chilling new perspective. The seller's attorney was unusually insistent about specific language in the deed, I told Morgan, spreading the documents across his conference table. At the time, I assumed it was just legal precision. But look at this clause about the watershed boundaries. Morgan studied the paperwork with intense focus. This language is comprehensive, he said slowly. All water sources, tributaries, and watershed catchment area. That is not typical boilerplate for a nature preserve, rub it. My closing attorney said it was necessary to protect the ecosystem. I argued, pulling out my own surveying maps. If you're preserving wetlands, you need to control the water that feeds them. But when I trace these boundaries against the federal watershed maps, the coverage area is much larger than I calculated. Morgan's expression grew sharper. How much larger? I overlaid the Federal Geological Survey maps with my property lines. The result made my stomach clench. The watershed that feeds a lake, it extends under most of the surrounding residential development. According to these federal maps, the entire township's natural water supply originates from springs and aquifers within my property boundaries. And the community's water system? Morgan asked. Built in 1952, according to Camila. But here's the thing, I said, pulling out another folder. I requested historical records from the Federal Water Rights Office as part of my due diligence. I can't find any federal permits or easement agreements from that time period. The community's water system appears to have been constructed without any federal oversight. Morgan was quiet for several minutes, his fingers steepled. He looked less like a small-town lawyer and more like a high-stakes strategist. Robert, do you remember anything unusual about the previous owner? It was a development company. I recalled they'd owned it for about 5 years. They planned to build luxury homes, but environmental groups fought their permits. They finally decided to sell rather than continue the legal battles. And before them, I flipped through my title search. Private ownership back to the 1990s. But there's a gap in the records around 1995. The property changed hands twice in 1 year. First from a long-term owner to an individual, then immediately to the development company. The details were sealed in some kind of legal settlement. My title insurance company assured me it wouldn't affect my purchase, since the title was clear. Morgan's phone rang, interrupting us. He glanced at the caller ID and held up a finger. "Excuse me, Robert, I need to take this." As he stepped into his private office, I continued to study the maps. The 1890s geological surveys were remarkably precise. They showed aquifers and flow patterns with a scientific accuracy that, as a surveyor, I deeply respected. What troubled me was a total absence of any 1952 documentation. If the community had a legitimate claim, there should be something. Instead, there was silence. Morgan returned several minutes later, his face grim. He sat down heavily. "Robert, that was a colleague who specializes in federal water rights litigation. I mentioned your situation to him yesterday, and has done some preliminary research. And the Lake Reserve property," Morgan said, choosing his words carefully, "was designated as a primary municipal water source under the 1890 Federal Water Rights Act. That designation has never been revoked or modified." "What does that mean exactly?" Morgan looked me square in the eye. "It means that in most places, the state controls water. But hey, that UN-repealed federal label still preempts all local and state rules. It's an antique key that somehow still opens every lock. It means that under federal law, whoever owns a deed to the Lake Reserve has exclusive control over the primary water source for this entire township. Any community water system built after 1890 would require federal easement agreements and ongoing compensation to the property owner." The implications were staggering. I felt the blood drain from my face. Are you saying the community has been using water illegally for 70 years? I'm saying the legal framework is extremely complex, Morgan corrected gently. And there are massive discrepancies between federal law and the local practices that have developed over decades. This explains why Camilla Williams called my office. She's not just worried about the future. She's worried about the legal validity of their current system. I stared at the documents, my conservation project turning to ash in my mouth. Marcus, I bought this property to preserve it, not to hold a town's water supply hostage. Is there a way to ensure the community keeps their access while I maintain the conservation protections? Theoretically, yes, he said. Federal easement agreements can be negotiated, but the process involves federal agencies, environmental reviews, and potentially significant compensation structures. Compensation. If you legally own exclusive water rights for 300 families, the fair market value of those rights could be substantial. Even if you wanted to provide access at minimal cost, federal law requires that any easement agreement reflects fair market compensation. I felt overwhelmed. How substantial are we talking about? Morgan pulled out a calculator. He ran some numbers based on municipal water valuations. Finally, he looked up. Conservatively, we're looking at somewhere between $10 and $15 million in total valuation. The number hit me like a physical blow. $15 million. That's a fair market value, Morgan said. It establishes the legal framework for any negotiation. Robert, he paused, did anyone explain this to you during your purchase? Your closing attorney should have identified these complications during the title search. Federal water rights designations are public record. He mentioned water rights. I said, my mind reeling. But he characterized it as environmental protection language. Nothing about this. So, what do I do now? We need to understand exactly what you've acquired, Morgan said, gathering the documents. I'll contact the Federal Water Rights Office and request a complete historical review. In the meantime, he added, I'd recommend avoiding any statements about future water access. Until we understand the full legal framework, anything you say could be used against you. I left his office in a daze. I had intended to buy 40 acres of quiet habitat. Instead, I had apparently acquired exclusive control over a vital public utility, with legal rights worth millions of dollars that I never wanted. As a surveyor, I specialize in boundary disputes. I should have seen this. Driving home, I passed the neighborhoods that had confronted me. Children played on lawns, families washed cars, gardens were being watered, all of them using water that, according to a law written in 1890, I now controlled. The responsibility was crushing. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday, exactly 1 week after my arrest. Camilla Williams had ensured every household in the township received a notice. The community center parking lot was overflowing. Cars lined the streets for blocks. Morgan had advised me to attend, but to say very little. Let them express their concerns, he'd said. Don't make any commitments until we understand the full legal picture. As I walked toward the building, I could already hear Camilla's voice booming through the open windows. She was already at the podium. Our water source is under attack, she declared to the packed auditorium. For 70 years, this community has maintained and protected our water system. We've paid taxes, maintained infrastructure, and fought off developers. And now, one man with a piece of federal paper thinks he can hold our families hostage. The crowd's response was immediate and angry. People were shouting, demanding action. These were families terrified of losing their homes. When I entered, the room fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned to me, their expressions ranging from hostile to fearful. Camilla saw me. Mr. Mitchell, I'm glad you're here. The community deserves to hear your intentions regarding our water. I made my way to the front, feeling the weight of their scrutiny. Thank you for inviting me. I want everyone to understand. I purchased a lake reserve to preserve it as a natural habitat. I never intended to disrupt anyone's water access. Intentions don't matter when federal law gives you exclusive control. Camilla shot back. What matters is what you plan to do with that control. A man in the front row stood up. My family has lived here for 40 years. Are you telling us we have no legal right to the water we've been using? Before I could answer, Camilla moved to a presentation easel. I've spent the past week researching Mr. Mitchell's purchase. What I discovered should concern every family here. She flipped the chart. The Lake Reserve property includes what federal law calls a primary municipal water source designation. This designation hasn't been updated since 1890, but it has never been revoked. Under current federal law, whoever owned that property has exclusive control over our water supply. The room erupted. Camila raised her hand for quiet. But that's not the worst part. I discovered that our community water system, built in 1952, was constructed without any proper federal easement agreements. Legally speaking, we've been using water without permission for over 70 years. A woman shouted from the back, "What does that mean for our property values? Our mortgages? If we don't have legal water access, what happens to our homes?" Camila's expression was grim. Properties without guaranteed water access are essentially unsellable. We are looking at potential financial devastation. The crowd's anger was escalating, but I noticed something odd. Camila was remarkably, almost professionally, well-informed about obscure 1890s federal water law for suburban HOA president. Just as the panic reached a crescendo, Marcus Morgan entered the room. "Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm Thomas Marcus Morgan, Mr. Mitchell's attorney. May I address some of the legal concerns you've raised?" Camila nodded. "Mr. Morgan, perhaps you can explain how your client's deed affects our rights." Morgan moved to the front. "Federal water rights law is extremely complex," he began, "but complexity doesn't mean there aren't solutions. Yes, Mr. Mitchell's property includes this federal designation. But federal law also provides mechanisms for community easement agreements that can protect both conservation goals and residential water access." "At what cost?" a man called out. "Are we going to have to pay this man for water we've used for decades?" Morgan's response was smooth. Easement agreements can be structured to minimize financial impact. The goal is finding a solution that works for everyone, not creating financial hardship. I was grateful for his diplomacy, but his expertise seemed almost too comprehensive for an attorney who had supposedly just learned the case. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed, I saw Morgan in an intense, quiet conversation with Camila near the parking lot. Their body language suggested a familiarity that went beyond a simple public meeting. As I watched from my truck, I saw Morgan lean in. Camila whispered something, and he handed her a document from his briefcase, which she quickly slipped into her folder. It was a smooth, practice exchange. When Morgan joined me at my truck, I asked him, "How long have you known Camila Williams?" His answer was immediate. "I don't know her personally. Tonight was the first time we've met face-to-face." As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed a lie. The next day, I received a call. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Dr. Sarah Clark. I'm a water rights historian at the State University, and I specialize in federal water allocation law from the 1800s. I believe I can help." I met her that afternoon. Dr. Clark was sharp, academic, and direct. Her office was covered in historical maps. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "your property's 1890 designation is a textbook case. The federal surveys were comprehensive. They identified your lake as a primary natural water source for the entire township. According to these maps, 90% of the area's natural water originates within your property. But how was a 1952 system built without federal approval?" "Post-war suburban development," she explained. "It was rapid, and federal oversight was limited. Local governments often assumed they had authority over sources that were, in fact, under federal jurisdiction. So, the community built their system in a legal gray area that's never been resolved. My attorney, Marcus Morgan, says he specializes in these cases. Have you worked with him?" Sarah paused. "Morgan. Yes, I've encountered his name. He has extensive experience with federal easement negotiations." Something in her tone made me press. "I prefer not to comment on other professionals, Mr. Mitchell," she said carefully. "But I will say these cases require very specialized knowledge." She introduced me to two other community members, Jim, a retired city planner, and Mary, a local teacher, who were also skeptical of Camila's fear-mongering and wanted a collaborative solution. For the first time, I felt like I had allies. As I was leaving, Sarah stopped me. Mr. Mitchell, I should mention, I received a call this morning from someone asking about my research into your property's designation. Who called? She checked her notes. An attorney, Marcus Morgan. He said he was researching historical precedents. I felt a chill. I hadn't told Morgan I was meeting with her. That night, I called the Federal Water Rights Office again and asked about recent inquiries regarding my property. Yes, Mr. Mitchell, the official said. We've had several inquiries. Most recently, an attorney requested a complete historical file. When was that request made? There was a pause and the sound of typing. Let's see. That request was logged 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, well before my property purchase was even finalized, long before I had ever been arrested, long before Morgan had ever met me. The county court preliminary hearing was 2 weeks after my arrest. Morgan had filed a motion for declaratory judgment, a legal move to establish my property rights and prevent the HOA from interfering with the preserve. This hearing should resolve the immediate concerns, Morgan assured me in his office. Once the court recognizes your federal property rights, we can negotiate the easement from a position of legal certainty. The courtroom was packed. Camila sat in the front row, flanked by her HOA board. Behind them, the faces from the community meeting watched me. Dr. Clark sat with Jim and Mary, a small island of support. Judge Catherine Morrison was efficient. She reviewed the documents, listening to Morgan's polished presentation about my conservationist goals and the legal mechanism for easements. Camila's attorney, David Harrison, argued that 70 years of continuous use and community investment should override the 1890 law. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift. Based on the documentation, Mr. Mitchell's federal deed establishes prima facie property rights. However, this court recognizes a community's legitimate interests. I am issuing a preliminary injunction preventing the HOA from interfering with Mr. Mitchell's property, while strongly encouraging all parties to negotiate a mutually acceptable federal easement. We left the courthouse. It felt like a victory. The hardest part is over, Morgan said, clapping me on the shoulder. Camila can't challenge your rights anymore. Now they have to work with you. Over the next week, I felt genuinely optimistic. I met with Sarah, Jim, and Mary, and we began to sketch out a framework for collaborative solution. Then Morgan called me into his office. I've drafted the easement agreement, he announced, sliding a thick document across his desk. This will formalize community water access while protecting your conservation goals. I read it. It looked comprehensive. It established permanent community water rights, included environmental protection clauses, and set provision for system maintenance. The annual fee structure is nominal, Morgan explained, barely enough to cover administrative costs. It protects your objectives while giving the community the legal certainty they need. It seemed perfect. It was exactly what everyone wanted. Are you sure the federal agencies will approve this? Absolutely, Morgan said. I've negotiated similar agreements. The agencies prefer collaborative solutions. I was impressed by his thoroughness. As I read through it again, a technical section caught my eye. Morgan, what does this section about a federal jurisdiction waiver mean? His explanation was smooth. That's standard language. It clarifies that the easement will operate under local jurisdiction rather than federal oversight. It simplifies administration and cuts down on bureaucracy. It made sense, but a small alarm bell went off in my head. I made a mental note to run it by Sarah Clark before I signed anything. The next morning, Morgan called, and his voice was urgent. Rob, we need to expedite the signing. I've just received word that Camila is preparing to file a federal challenge to your water rights designation. If she does that, it could tie up this entire process in litigation for years. It will be a nightmare. The thought of prolonged legal battles was nauseating. What's the timeline to prevent her challenge? If we get this easement agreement signed and filed with the federal agencies this week, it establishes your good faith effort. It makes her challenge look vindictive and unlikely to succeed. His urgency was convincing, but I still felt uneasy. Can I have until tomorrow to review the final terms? Of course, he said, but I strongly recommend not delaying. Camila's attorney is moving aggressively. We need to stay ahead of them. That afternoon, I tried to schedule an emergency meeting with Sarah Clark. Her assistant informed me she was attending an academic conference in another state and wouldn't be reachable until the following week. With Sarah unavailable and Morgan pressing for a quick decision, I was trapped. The agreement seemed fair. Delaying could mean years in court and risk poisoning the community against me forever. That evening, I returned to Morgan's office. I signed the easement agreement and authorized him to file it with the relevant federal agencies. "You've made the right decision, Rob," Morgan assured me, taking the signed pages. "This protects everyone and establishes a framework for long-term cooperation." I left his office feeling a profound sense of relief. It was over. I had preserved the lake and protected the community's water. The next morning, Morgan called, sounding triumphant. "Rob, great news. The federal agencies have already accepted our easement agreement for processing. We should have final approval within 2 weeks. That seems incredibly fast for federal bureaucracy. I have good working relationships with the relevant officers," he said smoothly. "When agreements are properly structured, the process moves efficiently." As I hung up, I finally relaxed. The lake was safe. The community was secure. I didn't realize I had just signed away a $15 million asset. I didn't know that Morgan's standard language had just quietly and illegally shifted federal control into the hands of the local HOA. And I didn't know that the real crisis was only just beginning. The call came 10 days after I signed the agreement. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Agent Daniel Hayes from the Federal Water Rights Division. Your filing triggered an automatic review against legacy federal designations in this region. I need to schedule an urgent meeting regarding your purchase and the easement you submitted." The formal tone put me on high alert. "Agent Hayes, is there a problem?" My attorney assured me it was structured properly. "Sir, I prefer to discuss this in person," Hayes said. "Are you available this afternoon? I can meet you at your property." I immediately called Morgan's office. His assistant informed me he was in court all day and unavailable. I left an urgent message. At 2 p.m., Agent Hayes arrived at the lake, accompanied by a federal attorney and a water rights specialist. "Mr. Mitchell," Hayes began, "I want to clarify your understanding of what you purchased. What did you believe you were buying?" "A 40-acre nature preserve," I said, "for conservation." Agent Hayes opened a thick folder. "According to federal records, you purchased significantly more. Under the Federal Water Rights Act of 1890, this property carries a primary municipal water source designation. Do you understand what that means?" My attorney explained it was a historical designation. I said, my voice faltering. Hayes was blunt. "Mr. Mitchell, let me be very clear. Under federal law, you have exclusive control over the primary water source for this entire township. That includes all 300 families." The words hung in the air, but the community has been using it for 70 years. The federal attorney spoke up. "Without proper federal authorization, Mr. Mitchell, their system was built without easement agreements or compensation. Legally, they have been trespassing for 7 decades. Under federal law, you have the right to terminate that water access immediately." I felt dizzy. I never wanted that. I just wanted to preserve the environment. "We understand your intentions," Hayes continued. "What's more concerning is this easement agreement you just signed." He pulled out Morgan's document. "This agreement attempts to transfer your federal water rights to local jurisdiction. That is not legally possible." "What do you mean?" "Federal water rights designated under the 1890 Act cannot be transferred to a local authority without an act of Congress," the attorney said. "Any agreement that attempts such a transfer is legally invalid. But more importantly, Mr. Mitchell, do you understand the financial value of what you own? Federal water rights of this source carry a fair market value in the millions." $15 million, I whispered. "That's a conservative estimate," Hayes confirmed. "You own one of the most valuable water rights properties in this region. The agreement you signed effectively defrauds you of that asset for nominal fees." The pieces slammed together. Morgan's pro bono offer, his prior research, the suspicious meeting with Camila, the false urgency. "Agent Hayes," I asked, my voice shaking, "why would my own attorney create an agreement that defrauds me?" Hayes and the attorney exchanged a look. "Mr. Mitchell, We've been investigating your attorney's previous cases. In 1995, Thomas Marcus Morgan represented the previous owner of this exact property in a similar dispute. That case ended with the owner selling the land at a deep discount after signing an invalid agreement that transferred his federal rights to local authority. The full, horrifying picture emerged. Are you suggesting Morgan and Camilla? We are investigating whether there has been a systematic pattern of federal water rights being transferred to local authorities through invalid legal agreements, Hayes said. Your case fits the pattern. Mrs. Williams appears to have had advanced knowledge of your property's status long before your purchase. After the agents left, I sat by the lake, stunned. I had been used. I was a pawn in a long-running fraud scheme. I immediately called Sarah Clark. Rob, she answered, her voice tense. I'm back. I've been trying to reach you. I reviewed Morgan's agreement. The jurisdiction language is a disaster. It's invalid. Sarah, I said, I just met with federal agents. They told me everything. The 1995 case, all of it. Rob, she said grimly, I think you need to consider that your entire situation, starting with your arrest, was orchestrated from the beginning. The next morning, I walked into Morgan's office at 7:30 a.m., my phone's voice recorder running. Morgan, we need to talk, I said, walking past the surprised secretary. He looked up, and for the first time, his composure cracked. Rob, I wasn't expecting you. I had a visit from federal agents. They told me about the 1995 case. They told me my $15 million water rights are intact, and the easement is a fraud. Morgan's face went pale. He finally slumped, defeated. Rob, it's more complicated than that. Then explain it. I said, placing the phone on his desk. The feds are opening a criminal investigation. This is your only chance. He confessed everything. Camilla had identified the property in 1995. She'd approached Morgan, then a young lawyer, to protect the community. He'd crafted the invalid agreement, and she had been blackmailing him into repeating the scheme with new, unsuspecting owners. She would identify the property, orchestrate the community crisis, and have Morgan step in as a savior to pressure the owner into signing away their rights. My arrest, the HOA meeting, it was all theater. I walked out of his office in a cold fury. I had the confession. I had the power. I could, with one call, cut off the town's water. For a moment, I was tempted. They deserved it. But as I drove past a local school, I saw the faces of the children. They weren't complicit. They were victims, just as I was. I called Agent Hayes. I have a full confession. But I have one question. If I pursue prosecution, what happens to the 300 families? Mr. Mitchell, Hayes said, that's the right question. We can implement a federal receivership. While the criminal case proceeds, a federal administrator manages the water system, ensuring uninterrupted community access. After, you can negotiate a permanent legal easement. The relief was overwhelming. 3 months later, I sat in federal court. Morgan and Camilla were part of a network that had defrauded properties across multiple states. Morgan, facing decades, was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and stripped of his license. Camilla, for a role as the orchestrator, received 4 years. In my victim impact statement, I looked at them. You used my desire to protect the environment as a weapon against me, but I refuse to let your betrayal turn me into the kind of person who uses legal power to harm innocent families. After, I worked with Sarah Clark, Jim, and Mary. We created a hybrid solution. The lake reserve remained my private conservation property, but the water system was transferred to a new, federally supervised community trust, led by Mary Anderson, ensuring transparent management and affordable rates. 6 months later, I stood by the lake with my children. Families from the community were enjoying the hiking trails. The water was safe, the preserve protected. I had learned that legal power is a burden. The law gives you rights, but your conscience tells you how to use them. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about choosing responsibility over profit and mercy over the cold letter of the law.